My daughter once looked me in the eyes and said the greatest gift I could ever give her was to vanish from her life forever. That cruel wish became the spark that changed everything. After decades of sacrifice, I decided to grant her request, but not in the way she imagined. What followed was a disappearance carefully planned, a shocking letter left behind, and a journey that led me to freedom in a faraway city. While my daughter's world collapsed without me, I discovered a life of peace, power, and dignity I never thought possible. This story is filled with betrayal, revenge, and unexpected rebirth. If you enjoy stories like this, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now let me take you back to the night it all began. It was late afternoon when I arrived at my daughter's house, a sprawling estate of polished marble floors and endless glass windows that shimmered in the last glow of daylight. The house looked like something out of a magazine, cold and perfect, standing proudly at the top of a hill. I clutched the velvet box in my hands as I walked up the stone steps. Inside was the gift I had chosen for her, a jeweled music box that had once belonged to my grandmother, passed down through generations of women in our family. It was a treasure I had guarded for decades, waiting for the day when I could place it in the hands of my daughter. To me, it was not just a gift. It was history, memory, and love, all sealed into a delicate object that had survived wars, moves, and heartbreak. The moment I knocked, I rehearsed in my mind the joy I imagined she would show. I thought of her smile when she was a little girl, the way her eyes lit up at surprises. I expected at least a fraction of that innocence, even though years had hardened her demeanor. But when the heavy door opened, the woman standing before me was not the daughter I had raised. Clara's face carried no warmth. Her eyes were sharp, her mouth pressed into a thin line, her brows raised in irritation as though my presence was an inconvenience. She did not greet me with a smile, not even a polite one. "Oh, it is you," she muttered, barely looking at me as she stepped aside to let me in. Her voice carried the weight of disdain, as though the sight of me was a burden she had to tolerate. My heart sank, but I forced a gentle smile and held out the gift. "Happy birthday, my love. I brought you something very special. It is a piece of our family, something I have kept safe all these years, waiting for this moment." She glanced at the box in my hands with disinterest and motioned toward the living room. The house smelled faintly of lilies and expensive candles, but the air was heavy with a kind of silence that made me uneasy. Inside, her husband David sat with a glass of wine, flipping through his phone as though I were invisible. Their children were nowhere in sight. The emptiness of the house pressed against me, reminding me of how far I had drifted from her life, even though I had given everything to keep it together. Clara sank into the velvet sofa, her eyes fixed on me in a way that made my hands tremble. She crossed her legs and leaned back, a posture of superiority I knew too well. "You know, Mother," she began slowly, "I have been thinking about my birthday. I have been thinking about gifts, about what would truly make me happy. And I realized there is only one thing." Her tone was chilling, deliberate, each word delivered with the precision of a blade. I felt my chest tighten, but I forced myself to nod. "Of course, my dear. Tell me what you want, and I will do everything in my power to give it to you. Anything at all." Her lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. Her eyes narrowed with an expression I had never seen directed at me before. "The one gift that would mean the most to me," she said, pausing, as if savoring the cruelty of the moment, "is if you would simply disappear, if you would vanish from my life forever." The words fell into the room like shards of glass, shattering the air around me. For a moment I thought I had misheard her, that perhaps it was some cruel joke, an attempt at dark humor. But her face remained expressionless, unflinching, as though she had spoken nothing but the plain truth. What I whispered, my throat dry. "You heard me," she replied coldly. "The greatest gift you could give me is to go away. I am tired of your visits, your calls, your presence. You suffocate me. You cling to me like a shadow, and I cannot breathe. My life would be easier, lighter, if you were gone." My knees weakened and I sank onto the edge of a chair. My hands clutched the music box so tightly that the velvet pressed harsh lines into my palms. 70 years of living, 4 decades of motherhood, all of it seemed to collapse in that moment. I stared at my daughter, the child I had carried, fed, clothed, and loved with every ounce of my being, and all I could see in her eyes was contempt. "Clara," I stammered, "I am your mother. I have given everything for you." I have sacrificed my life for you." "Exactly," she snapped, cutting through my words. "And that is the problem. You have lived through me. You have tied every sacrifice to my life as though it makes me owe you something. But I do not want your sacrifices. I want my freedom. I want you gone." Her words struck me harder than any blow. I looked toward David, hoping for some sign of compassion, some defense of the woman who had supported them both through countless struggles, but he did not even raise his eyes from his glass. He let the silence confirm her words. I stood slowly, my legs trembling beneath me, and placed the box on the table in front of her. My voice shook as I whispered, "Happy birthday, Clara." For a moment I waited, searching her face, for even the faintest flicker of remorse, some shadow of the child I had once known. But all I found was impatience, the silent demand that I leave. The music box sat unopened, its jewels catching the glow of the chandelier, but she made no move to touch it. My gift, my love, my history, all left to sit untouched in a room where I no longer belonged. I walked out of the house that night with tears burning down my face. The sky outside was heavy with clouds, the air sharp with the chill of an approaching storm. Every step I took away from that door felt like a farewell, as though I were leaving behind not only my daughter but the very life I had built for her. By the time I reached the bottom of the hill, I knew something inside me had broken beyond repair. Her words echoed in my mind, wrapping themselves around my heart like chains. She wanted me gone. She wanted me to disappear. And perhaps I thought as I stood under the darkening sky, that is exactly what I would do. But not in the way she expected. Because sometimes a cruel wish is not just a curse. Sometimes it becomes the beginning of something far more powerful. That night, after leaving Clara's house, I walked through the city streets as if in a dream. The lamps glowed dimly, their halos blurred by the tears clouding my vision. My footsteps echoed in the empty silence, but inside me a louder echo repeated every word Clara had spoken. Disappear. Vanish. Go away. The phrases turned over and over until they cut into me like glass. By the time I reached my small apartment, my hands were trembling so violently that I almost dropped my keys. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and leaned against it as though the wood itself could hold me up. The room was quiet, filled with the faint scent of lavender from the candle I had left burning earlier in the day. Yet the silence offered no comfort. I was alone, carrying words too heavy to bear. The jeweled music box was not with me. I had left it there on her polished table like a relic cast aside. That hurt almost as much as her words. Something that had survived generations, something sacred now abandoned to gather dust. I sank into the old sofa, the same one where I had once rocked Clara as a baby, where I had read her bedtime stories until she fell asleep against my chest. I touched the fabric worn and faded now, and I wondered how the child who had once clung to me so tightly could have turned into a woman who wished me gone. As the night deepened, memories began to surge. They came unbidden like waves breaking through the dam I had built around them. I remembered the winter when Clara was 3 years old, her tiny body racked with pneumonia. I had worked triple shifts at the hospital to pay for the medicine, $1,200 I did not have. I sold my mother's gold earrings and bracelet heirlooms of my own childhood to buy the antibiotics that saved her life. I remember holding her through nights of fever, whispering prayers I was not sure anyone heard, and when she finally opened her eyes and whispered, "Mama," I knew every sacrifice had been worth it. When she was 16, the memory was brighter but just as costly. Prom night, she wanted the pink dress in the shop window, the one that shimmered under the lights like a dream. It cost $800 more than I could ever justify on a nurse's salary. But I worked weekends for months, cleaning houses after 12-hour shifts at the hospital. When she tried on that dress and spun around, her eyes sparkling, she threw her arms around me and said, "Thank you, Mama. You are the best in the world." In that moment, I felt richer than any woman alive. College came next. Clara changed her major 3 times, each time abandoning the previous path, like it had meant nothing. But I paid every tuition bill, every book fee, every late charge. $42,000 in total scraped together through a second mortgage on my house. I told myself that her education was the key to her future, that my sacrifices were investments in her happiness. Then came her wedding. Clara wanted it in the grand ballroom downtown filled with roses and crystal chandeliers. $35,000. I signed check after check, watching my retirement savings vanish into flowers and champagne. But when she walked down the aisle glowing like a queen, I told myself it was worth it. I wanted her to have everything, even if it meant leaving myself with nothing. The house was the largest sacrifice of all. When Clara and David decided to buy, they needed a down payment. I gave them $150,000, every penny of my savings. I told myself it was love. I told myself it was what mothers did. But standing in that empty apartment staring at the peeling wallpaper, I wondered if I had simply been blind, and it had not ended there. When their twins were born, I became the unpaid babysitter night after night so they could attend parties and dinners. When David lost his job, I paid the mortgage for 8 months straight, $16,000 that left me eating rice and beans. When the children needed braces, I paid another $4,000 without a second thought. Each time I told myself this was what family meant. As the memories unraveled, I pulled out the boxes stored beneath my desk. Inside were the receipts, the contracts, the proof of every dollar I had ever spent. I had never kept them out of mistrust. They were trophies in a way, reminders of the love I had poured into my daughter's life. But now as I spread them across the table, they felt like evidence in a trial. Piece by piece, I began to add it all. The childhood expenses, the dress, the tuition, the wedding, the down payment, the mortgage, the braces. Every gift, every holiday, every moment I had chosen to give rather than keep for myself. By the time I finished, the total sat before me like a verdict. Over $460,000, nearly $500,000 spent on love that had been met with contempt. My hands shook as I wrote the number on a scrap of paper. $460,000. If I had placed that money in even the simplest savings account with interest, I would now be living in comfort. I could have traveled the world, lived in a seaside cottage, eaten fine meals instead of stretching every penny. Instead, I had given it all away, believing that love would come back to me in return. But love had not come back, only bitterness, only the cruel demand that I vanish. I pressed my palms to my face, tears slipping through my fingers. Had it all been a lie? Had every hug, every thank you, every whispered, "I love you, Mama," been nothing more than manipulation? Or had I simply raised a daughter who learned to take and never to give? The clock ticked past midnight. My apartment was silent except for the faint creaks of the building settling in the night. But inside me a storm raged louder than thunder. At 3 in the morning I rose from the sofa. My grief was still there, but something else had begun to grow beside it. Anger, indignation, a spark of clarity that I had not felt in years. I looked down at the piles of receipts and contracts scattered across the table, and I knew what I had to do. Clara wanted me gone. She wanted me erased from her life as though I had never existed. Very well. I would grant her that wish, but not as the broken woman who had left her house in tears. I would disappear on my own terms. And before I vanished, I would make sure she understood exactly what it meant to live without me. In the pale blue of early morning, I sat at my kitchen table with the receipts spread like a map of a life given away. The city outside was slow to wake, and in those quiet hours I felt the full weight of what had happened pressed down on me. Grief was still raw, but grief had changed shape. It had become something harder and colder. It had become purpose. I had always believed that love required sacrifice, that a mother's duty was to give, until there was nothing left. For decades I had held that belief like a sacred truth. Now I saw that I had mistaken obligation for love, and that realization opened a door I had closed long ago. I began to think with numbers, with facts, with the stark clarity of someone who had been awakened from a long dream. Each receipt told a story. The medicine that saved a child, the dress that made a teen's night unforgettable, the tuition payments paid on borrowed hours of sleep. There were smaller things, too, the dinners, the birthday presents, the late-night drives to emergency rooms. Each entry was a thread woven into a tapestry that had sustained another life while eroding my own. I could feel the years like coins stacked and spent until there was nothing but the echo of what had been given. Anger arrived quietly at first, then like a tide. It was not the hot rage that destroys in the moment. It was a steady anger that clarified rather than consumed. It asked me why I had not asked for anything in return. It asked me why I had allowed my worth to be measured by how much I could provide. There was no single moment of betrayal. Betrayal had been patient. It had crept in through favors rendered without question, through the steady erosion of boundaries. The word that settled in my chest was recognition. I recognized that I had been living someone else's story for too long. The thought came to me not as a fancy, but as a plan forming under the pressure of necessity. If she wanted me gone, then I could make that happen on my own terms. The idea was not born from spite alone. It was born from a need to reclaim the life I had spent handing away. Disappearing would be the act, but there needed to be more than spectacle. There needed to be a statement, a clean severing of the ties that had strangled me for decades. I stood and walked to the small bookshelf where I kept the documents that had once made me proud. The boxes were dusty, but inside, everything was ordered, labeled, and precise. I pulled them out and sat back down at the table. The careful lists of payments looked like evidence in a case I had never meant to bring. I had kept those papers because they made me feel secure. Now they would serve another purpose. Thought by thought, I began to craft a course of action. First, I would recover what I could. There were accounts in which I had been generous with no expectation of return. Those arrangements could be revised. Insurance beneficiaries could be changed. A will could be rewritten. I had always feared the legalities. I had always feared confrontation. But legal steps were tools, and tools were how one built a new life. Next, I would create a message that would cut through the polite explanations and the excuses people offer themselves when confronted with their own selfishness. I did not want to humiliate. I did not want vengeance that fed only itself. I wanted clarity. I wanted the truth to stand in the open and be impossible to ignore. The letter would be precise, listing the payments, the favors, the nights spent awake. It would explain that everything I had been done from a place of hope and love, and that the refusal to acknowledge that care had finally become a reason to leave. It would make visible the invisible labor that had been erased for so long. I imagined how Clara would read those pages. I pictured the first disbelief and then the slow dawning of panic as the practical consequences took shape. I knew she would say she had been angry in the moment. She would say it was an offhand, cruel thing said in frustration. People always reach for excuses when their safety net is removed. My departure would force her to reckon with the fact that words have weight and that actions have consequences. There was fear in the plan, too. Leaving meant stepping into unknown terrain at an age when most begin to shrink their world. There were medical appointments, routines, friends I would miss. There was the practical terror of creating a new life far from the familiar. But there was also a fierce excitement that surprised me. For the first time in decades, I considered what I might do with my time, my money, and my energy if I were not constantly redirecting them to someone else's needs. The possibility of travel, of learning, of quiet mornings spent on my own terms floated before me like a promise. I reached out to a lawyer I had trusted for years and made a series of appointments. I wanted to understand the mechanics of reversals and transfers and rights. The lawyer listened without judgment, and then laid out the options with a calm precision that steadied me. It would take paperwork time and some courage. It would also require me to be meticulous and unflinching. That was something I had rarely been when it came to Clara. For the first time, I felt willing to be meticulous and unflinching for my own sake. Then there was the more delicate matter of allies. I had one person in mind who could play a crucial role. Margot had been my neighbor for years. She was a retired actress with a generous spirit and a talent for timing and performance. We had shared coffee and laughter and small comforts. Margot had watched my visits and had seen the strain on my face. She had offered a kind of companionship that was different from familial duty. I needed someone I could trust to hold a secret and to perform when the moment required it. Margot was more than willing. She understood instinctively that sometimes the stage must be set for truth to be seen. The plan began to take shape in my mind, like a carefully staged play. There would be a staged disappearance that would allow me to step away without spectacle but with clarity. I would leave a letter, a dossier of documents, and a simple statement explaining that I had chosen a life for myself and that I would no longer be the default savior for others. Margot would be the witness who discovered the absence, the concerned neighbor who would bring the facts to light in a way that could not be ignored. I felt the old fear return at intervals. Would I be accused of melodrama? Would neighbors gossip? Would my granddaughters cry and never forgive me? There were risks and unknowns, but the alternative was a life of continued erasure. The fear was heavy, but it was a weight I could bear because it was a chosen burden. I would no longer be moved by the demands of others alone. As dawn brightened the sky, I wrote the first lines of what would become my letter. I kept my tone simple and steady. I would not plead. I would not beg. I would tell the truth as plainly as possible. I would explain my reasons and then I would go. My hands did not tremble as they had days before. They were steady with resolve. When I finished the first page, I read it aloud in the empty room. The words sounded strange and final. They felt like the closing of a door and the opening of another. I folded the paper and placed it in an envelope. There was a line between sorrow and strength that I had crossed. On the other side waited a life I had not allowed myself to imagine. I packed a small suitcase as if leaving on a quiet journey. I chose clothes that felt like the person I wanted to be. I called the travel agency I had considered in a fleeting dream months before and inquired about a place where one could begin anew without questions and without the weight of old expectations. The agent was practical and kind, and a plan began to take shape that felt less like escape and more like a reclamation. Yet even as I prepared each step, another apprehension rose. Was I being selfish in a way that might later be regretted? Would I be depriving those children of a grandmother who had been their comfort and joy? The questions did not drown the purpose. They made it clearer, as if the shadows around a path only sharpened the edges of the path itself. I sealed the first envelope and placed it among the receipts. My heart beat steady and sure. I had moved from shock to calculation to action. The smallest details of life now mattered in a way they had not when I moved through days for the sake of others. I felt awake in a way that was finally mine. And then a thought crossed my mind that made the blood run cold and the pulse quicken. If I was going to vanish, how could I be sure no one would follow? If I was going to leave an explanation that would change their lives, who would ensure they read it? The plan was budding into being, but it needed one last element to survive: the chaos it would unleash. I picked up the phone and dialed Margot's number. Her voice answered on the second ring. I told her simply that it was time to begin. Her pause was brief. Then she laughed softly and said that she had been waiting for this scene her whole life. I told her where to meet me and what to bring. We agreed on a day, a performance, and a truth. As I hung up, I felt both terrified and exhilaratingly free. The final steps were near. The disappearance would be deliberate, precise, and irreversible. I took one last look at the table where the receipts lay like a map. I folded them and I put them away. The path was set. The door was almost ready to close. Somewhere in the next rooms, she slept unaware, or so I hoped. Somewhere in the next days, her life would be altered in ways she had never imagined. I closed the window and watched the first pale light of morning touch the city, and I knew that the next act would change everything. The morning I put the plan into motion felt both ordinary and impossible. The sky was pale and steady, the city moving as if nothing had shifted. I made my coffee slowly, as if by stretching the ritual I could hold on to something familiar. Each small task felt monumental now. Every signature, every call, every form was a thread being cut and rewoven into a new life. The receipts I had collected lay folded at my elbow, and I read them again as if they were a map. They were still evidence, but now they guided me instead of haunting me. My first stop was the bank. The marble lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish. I walked up to the desk with the same careful composure I had learned over decades of hospital shifts and family crises. I asked to meet with the account manager I had known for years. He recognized me immediately and greeted me with a practiced warmth. I did not want small talk. I wanted facts and signatures. He led me into a quiet office and asked how he could help. I told him that I wanted to close the joint account and transfer the funds to my personal account. I did not elaborate. He glanced at the paperwork and then at me, and in that look I realized how strange it must seem to suddenly withdraw support. It would be easier to continue as before, to be the accommodating mother, the one people assumed would always be there, but easier and right were rarely the same. I signed the forms in a steady hand. The clerk verified the balance and moved the money. Watching the number confirm felt like turning a page. Next, I went to the mortgage office. The walk there took me past shops and small cafes where people were still stepping out with newspapers and pastries. The world carried on while my life changed. I met with a polite loan officer who pulled up the file where my name sat as co-signer. I asked for a full review of my rights. It was a delicate thing to negotiate. Co-signing had once felt like a gesture of love and security. Now it was leverage, a legal fact that could be used to secure what I had invested. The officer explained the mechanics, the risks, and the remedies. I listened and asked a dozen quiet questions. When I left, I had the documents I needed to begin the reclamation if necessary, but I also had a sense of the power that comes from understanding the rules. The lawyer was the last stop that morning. He received me with a measured calm that steadied my nerves. We went through everything slowly, methodically, the way surgeons review an operation. "Change the beneficiaries," he said. Write the will," he added. "Notify the insurance company. File the proper notices." He spoke in plain terms, so I could see each step as accomplishable. I felt practical, precise, and impossibly relieved. The legal world had a vocabulary for what I was doing. That vocabulary made it real. Back at the apartment, I began the more personal work. I wrote the letter with a hand that did not waver. I used plain sentences and direct language. I listed the payments, the nights, the sacrifices, the ways I had held their family when it was about to fall. I wrote without bitterness and without apology. I wanted the truth to sit naked on the page so that no excuses could hide behind it. The letter explained that I had chosen my own life and that I would not return to the old pattern. It concluded with the declaration that I was leaving on a new path and that I would no longer be a safety net for those who refused to see me. The dossier took longer than the letter. I organized receipts in chronological order so the story of my support could be read like a timeline. Each page showed a chapter of giving, and the sum at the end was stark and undeniable. I included copies of bank transfers, wedding contracts, tuition receipts, and mortgage statements. I compiled a final list of actions I had taken legally to sever financial ties, a formal record, so that no one could claim ignorance later. The papers felt heavy in the envelope. They were truth made physical. Margot arrived at noon. She came in smiling, wearing a bright scarf and the kind of fearless composure that had once made her a star on small stages. She sat at my kitchen table and poured us both tea without asking how I felt. The ease of her presence was a gift. She had watched me for months and she had said little. Now she sat and listened as I explained the schedule, the signals, the moment when she would act. She understood timing the way an actress understands a pause. She asked questions not about what I would lose, but about how we would ensure the message landed. We rehearsed the sequence carefully. Margot would ring my bell at a set hour, 2 days after my departure, and then call the police if there was no answer. She would tell them she had found the door locked and then use the spare key I kept in her care to enter. She would find the letter and the dossier on the table, and she would report that I had disappeared, leaving an explanation. The plan was not cruel. It was precise. I wanted no ambiguity about my choice, and no easy path for explanations that would minimize what had happened. That evening, I packed a suitcase. I chose clothes that were comfortable and a few that felt like the person I had been when life was still an open horizon. I brought my passport and a small sum in cash. I tucked the letter and the dossier into an envelope and set it on the table where Margot would find it. My hands did not shake as much as I had feared. There was a new steadiness that came from following through on a decision that had been born from betrayal and refined into purpose. The night before I left, I walked through the apartment slowly. Each room had a memory, a small relic of an earlier life. I touched the frame of a faded photograph and thought of laughter at a holiday long past. I left small notes for neighbors and friends that were practical and plain. I did not stage melodrama. I did not want the world to see me as fragile. I wanted to be seen as someone who had chosen differently. The breakfast the next morning was quiet. Margot came by early under the pretense of borrowing sugar. She hugged me and then glanced aside as if reading the day on my face. She took the envelope from the table as planned and tucked it into her bag. The cab arrived on time. I took a last look at the building where I had lived and given for decades. The door closed. The cab moved away. At the airport, the final small fears rose like flares. Would the news chase me across borders? Would someone call the police and follow a trail? I moved through the terminal with the simplicity of someone who had practiced departure as ritual. The agent stamped my passport. The plane waited. I sat by the window and watched the city shrink. My phone vibrated once before I turned it off. A single missed call from an unknown number. For a moment, I felt the old urge to answer every call for every crisis. Then I remembered why I was leaving and let the phone stay dark. As the plane began its slow roll, and then the lift the city below blurred into shapes, and then into one continuous memory that I had finally stepped away from. In the seat across from me, someone read a travel magazine, oblivious to the small revolution my life had just completed. I closed my eyes and thought of the letter sitting on a table where it would soon be discovered and read and felt. Would they understand, I wondered, or would everything unravel into anger and attempts to undo what I had chosen? Margot would find the apartment empty and speak the truth with a practiced voice, but the truth has a way of sparking many reactions. Somewhere between the ground and the sky, I felt the balance tip toward possibility and away from the life I had lost. The plane climbed into cloud and the city fell away. I breathed and felt an unfamiliar lightness. But even as new life began, a small part of me clenched with a question that would not go quiet. Had I planned everything that mattered, had I accounted for the ways people fight to hold what they depend on, the envelope would create the story, but stories rarely end the way their authors expect. Below us, the world turned, and I sat with my hands folded watching the clouds, and knowing that the next hours would reveal whether the disappearance would be a clean break or the opening of a new kind of storm. The plane climbed, and my horizon widened. I leaned back and tried to imagine a morning that did not call my name. And then the thought came that hardened my resolve and quickened my pulse. Margot would knock on the door the next day. She would find the envelope and the dossier and the music box I had left on the table. She would do exactly as we had rehearsed. The question was not whether they would find the evidence. The question was what they would do with it. The plane crossed a band of light, and for a moment the whole world seemed waiting for the knock that would change everything. The plane touched down on foreign soil under a soft, silvery dawn. As the wheels screeched against the runway, I felt the last ties of my old life fray and break. The air that seeped through the vents carried a strange crispness, as if even the oxygen of this new country was different. I clutched my small suitcase and watched as passengers around me stood stretching, chatting, already reaching for the lives that awaited them. For me, there was nothing waiting. And that, for the first time in my life, was freedom. I had chosen Lisbon because it was both familiar and unfamiliar. The ocean air was saltier than the air I had breathed at home. The streets wound in hills and alleys that seemed made to hide secrets, and the language flowed like water I could almost, but not quite understand. It was a city built for reinvention, for those who needed to vanish into beauty and start again. The travel agency had arranged a temporary apartment for me tucked into a quiet street paved with patterned stones. The building was old but graceful. Its walls painted the faded yellow of sunflowers left too long in the Sunday. The landlord, a stout man with kind eyes, carried my suitcase up the narrow staircase and handed me a set of keys that felt heavier than they should. As the door creaked open, I stepped into a space that smelled faintly of fresh bread and wood polish. There was a small balcony overlooking tiled rooftops, and beyond them the shimmer of the Tagus River winding like a silver ribbon. For the first hour, I did not unpack. I simply stood by the window staring at the water as the sun rose. I was no longer the woman who had been told to vanish, as though she were an inconvenience. I was a woman who had left on her own terms, carrying only what mattered. The city seemed to breathe with me, and for the first time in years I inhaled deeply without feeling the choke of obligation. But the silence was different here. It was not the silence of being ignored in my daughter's house, or the silence of sitting alone in an empty apartment that once echoed with family laughter. It was the silence of possibility. and yet beneath that silence a thread of fear remained. Every ring of the phone, every knock on the door, every shadow passing the window carried the question, had they discovered what I had done? Would they come looking for me? I decided to anchor myself in small rituals. Each morning I walked to the cafe at the corner, where an elderly man served coffee strong enough to jolt even the deepest sorrow awake. I bought a single pastel pastry and ate it slowly, savoring the sweetness on my tongue, a sweetness I had long denied myself. In the afternoons I wandered through markets, listening to the chatter of vendors and the clinking of coins. I bought a scarf of deep blue silk, an indulgence I had never dared before. It cost more than I should have spent, but I did not care. For once, money was mine to spend on joy rather than survival. I began to write in a journal each night, recording every step of the transformation. I wrote about the bank where I had closed accounts, the lawyer who had helped me, the letter I had left behind on the table, the look I imagined on Clara's face when Margot told her the truth. Writing gave me distance, a way to shape my choices into a story I controlled. Still, unease hovered at the edges. One evening as I returned from the market, I thought I saw a man lingering across the street watching my window. When I looked again, he was gone, swallowed by the alley. Another time the phone rang late at night. The number was unfamiliar. My hand trembled over the receiver, but I let it ring until it stopped. The silence afterward was heavier than before. On the third week I met a group of expatriates at a small library tucked behind a church. They were older like me, each carrying their own stories of reinvention. Some had fled unhappy marriages, others had abandoned corporate lives that drained them dry. We sat around a wooden table sipping tea and trading fragments of our pasts. I did not share the full truth, but I spoke enough to feel seen. One woman, Ingrid, placed her hand on mine and said, "You are brave. You have done what many dream of, but few dare." That night I walked home lighter. Perhaps I was not as alone as I had believed. But even as I grew roots in Lisbon, the past still whispered. I imagined Clara storming through my apartment, finding the letter and the dossier, her voice rising in outrage as Margot calmly explained my choice. I pictured her calling banks, calling lawyers, trying to undo what I had set in motion. I knew her well enough to understand she would not accept defeat easily. She would fight, she would twist words, she would paint herself the victim. And I knew that across the sea storms were already brewing. One afternoon I sat by the river with my journal, the breeze tugging at its pages. I wrote a single question at the top of the page: how long before they reach across the ocean? The ink bled slightly where my hand trembled. I closed the book and watched the water. The river carried ships out to sea, their sails swelling in the wind, disappearing toward horizons I could not see. I envied their certainty. The fear sharpened into a kind of thrill. For the first time, my life carried mystery. I had always known what tomorrow would bring: another shift, another payment, another favor asked, another sacrifice made. Now tomorrow was unwritten, dangerous, exciting. Each step was my own. Yet deep down, I knew the silence from home would not last. Clara had always depended on me too much to let go so easily. And David, though quieter, had a way of following her lead. They would not sit idle while their safety net was cut away. They would hunt for explanations, for leverage, for ways to pull me back. That evening, as I closed the balcony doors, I heard the faint buzz of my phone. The number flashing on the screen was foreign yet familiar enough to chill me. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the button. Did I dare answer? Or was this the moment the storm I had left behind finally crossed the ocean? The phone kept buzzing on the table, its glow cutting through the shadows of the apartment. I stared at the number, of foreign code that seemed to stretch like a hand reaching across the ocean. My thumb hovered above the button, caught between the instinct to answer and the fear of letting my world collapse with a single word. After 4 long rings, the phone fell silent. The apartment was still again, but the silence now pulsed with danger. The next morning I learned what I had feared. The call had not been random. It was only the beginning. Back in my old city, Clara was unraveling. At first, she had laughed when Margot told her I had disappeared, thinking it was a dramatic gesture that would fade with time. But when she opened the envelope I had left behind, when she saw the letter and the stack of receipts and documents, her laughter curdled into panic. Every page stripped away the life she had built on my sacrifices. Bank accounts closed, insurance policies rewritten, inheritance gone. The safety net she had relied on all her life had been cut clean through. David tried to calm her, telling her it was a bluff, a mother's overreaction, a performance that would end in a few days. But even he felt the tremor when the bank called to confirm that the joint account was empty, that the funds had been transferred. Then the mortgage office contacted them, explaining that as co-signer, I now had the right to reclaim the property. The mansion they had paraded as their pride was no longer secure. The walls themselves seemed to tilt under the weight of their crumbling illusion. Clara's anger grew sharp, bitter a storm with no outlet. She called Margot repeatedly, demanding details, spitting accusations. Margot, with the poise of an actress who had played this scene 100 times, simply told her the truth. Your mother made her choice. She wanted freedom. Accept it. The words burned, because Clara was not built to accept anything less than control. In desperation, she began making calls of her own. To banks, to lawyers, to anyone who might undo what I had done. She accused me of being unstable, of suffering from confusion, of making reckless decisions that endangered not only myself but the family. She argued that the documents should not stand, that no one in their right mind would cut ties so completely. Each attempt, however, ran into the same wall. The signatures were mine, clear and valid, and the choices were legally sound. When the legal path failed, she turned to manipulation. She left message after message on my phone, each one shifting in tone. The first few were soft, almost pleading. Mother, I did not mean it. I was stressed. Come home and we will forget everything. Then the tone hardened. How could you do this to us? Do you know what you are destroying? Then came the threats. If you do not come back, I will tell everyone you are senile, that you are being exploited, that you are not in your right mind. I listened to each message in the dim light of my Lisbon apartment, my chest tight, my hands trembling. Her voice, once the center of my life, had become something else entirely. It was a chain trying to pull me back across the ocean. Yet behind her anger I heard the fear of losing comfort, fear of facing life without my constant support. It was not me she missed, it was what I had provided. The calls became more frequent, almost frantic. At dawn, at midnight, during the slow hours of the afternoon, I stopped answering altogether, but that did not silence her. She left long, rambling voicemails, some sobbing, others cursing, each one carrying the stench of desperation. David eventually added his own voice. His tone was gentler, almost apologetic, as though he finally saw the truth. Please, he said, the children do not understand why you are gone. They ask about you every day. Clara told them you are sick, that you cannot come to visit. But I know they deserve the truth. Please just speak to them once. The plea pierced deeper than I expected, but I held firm. I knew speaking to them now would open the door for Clara to twist my love back into chains. Then Clara escalated. She filed a complaint with social services, claiming that I was suffering from dementia, that I had been manipulated into abandoning my family and making dangerous financial decisions. She painted herself as the worried daughter trying to save her confused mother. It was a cruel inversion of the truth, but cruelty was her weapon of choice. Officials contacted me through the consulate asking for a medical evaluation. For a moment, I feared the trap would close, that I would be dragged back into the web I had cut free from, but the examination proved what I already knew. I was clear, lucid, and deliberate. The doctors reported that I had chosen my actions with full awareness. The complaint was dismissed. Clara's attempt to brand me as unstable had failed, but the damage to my heart lingered. To be called senile by the daughter I had raised, to be accused of madness for daring to live for myself, it was another betrayal sharper than the first. By the 5th week, the desperation in her voice had shifted again. No longer proud, no longer furious, it now trembled with fear. She admitted in one message that the bank had scheduled a meeting about the mortgage. She confessed that bills were piling up, that the lifestyle she had built was crumbling without my silent hand holding it steady. Her words spilled like broken glass. "You cannot do this," she cried. "You are going to ruin us. Please, please come back." For years she had never said please. Now the word fell from her lips like a last resort. I sat on my balcony as the messages played, watching the river darken under the sunset. For a brief moment, sorrow pulled at me. I thought of the little girl she once was, the girl who had clung to me when storms shook the windows. But that girl was gone, replaced by a woman who had traded love for entitlement, gratitude for cruelty. And yet I could not ignore the danger in her desperation. People in panic do reckless things. Clara had already tried lies and accusations. What would she attempt next? That night, as I closed my journal, I wrote a single line at the bottom of the page: "She will not stop. Not until she is forced to face the truth." I put down the pen and listened to the silence of the apartment, but even in silence I could hear her voice, sharp and desperate, echoing across the ocean. The storm had not passed. It was only gathering strength. The calls from Clara eventually stopped, but the silence that followed felt more dangerous than the noise. For days my phone lay quiet on the table, the screen black, as if the ocean itself had swallowed her voice. Yet I knew her too well. Silence was not surrender. It was calculation. She had retreated only to plan her next move, and I could almost feel the storm shifting, finding a new direction. One evening, as I walked home from the market with a bag of bread and oranges, I saw Margot's name glowing on my phone. My heart raced. She never called without reason. I answered quickly. Her voice was low, steady, but there was an edge to it. "Clara came to see me today. She was furious. Said she knows I helped you. She accused me of lying, of hiding things. I kept my composure just like we practiced. But Elena, her eyes? I have never seen such coldness." I stopped in the street, the bag of bread dangling in my hand. "What did you tell her?" I told her the truth, Margot said. "That you made your choice, that you were free now." And I told her something else. That some disappearances are not tragedies, they are justice. Her words carried both courage and danger. I could picture Clara's face twisting with rage at the sound of them. For a moment I wished Margot had said less, had protected herself more, but Margot was not one to flinch. She had stood beside me from the beginning, and in that moment I knew she would not betray me. Later that night, as the city fell into quiet, I sat by the window of my apartment in Lisbon, watching the lights shimmer on the river. Clara was circling, and the net was tightening. I could feel it in my bones. She had lost her grip on me, but she was not finished. She was a woman who lived by control, and when control slips, desperation sharpens into cruelty. The proof came a week later. A letter arrived, forwarded through the travel agency, its envelope smudged and bent. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, my daughter's script sharp and angular, cutting across the paper. Inside the letter was both a plea and a threat. She wrote that she was sorry that she had not meant her words on her birthday. She wrote that she missed me, that the children cried for me, that David could not calm them. But between those softer lines, her rage bled through. "If you do not come back," she wrote, "I will find you. I will make sure the world sees you for what you are: selfish, senile, ungrateful. Do you want to die in a foreign land, forgotten?" I read the letter 3 times, each line heavier than the last. She had crossed the ocean with her words, trying to drag me back into her shadow. Yet instead of fear, I felt something else rise inside me. A clarity sharper than glass. Her threats no longer bound me. They exposed her for what she was: a woman, terrified not of losing her mother, but of losing the comfort my sacrifices had bought her. Still, I knew I had to protect myself. I met again with my lawyer in Lisbon, a patient man with gray hair and steady hands. He listened as I read Clara's letter aloud, his eyes narrowing slightly. "She is grasping," he said. "People who depend on others will fight hardest when their safety is taken away. But remember, she has no power here. Not legally, not financially. What she has are words, and words only have as much power as you allow them." Yet I also knew words could wound. They had nearly destroyed me once already. In the following weeks, Clara's tactics grew bolder. She contacted old family friends, spinning stories that I had abandoned her without cause, that I had been manipulated by outsiders, that I was not myself. Some believed her. Others reached out to me quietly, sending messages of confusion, even pity. Their sympathy stung not because I needed it, but because it showed how easily lies could travel. Then came the confrontation I had feared most. One afternoon, Margot called again. Her voice shook this time. "Elena," she said. "Clara came back. She was waiting at my door when I returned from the market. She demanded to know where you are. She said she would never stop until she found you." I sat in silence, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles whitened. "What did you tell her?" I whispered. "I told her," Margot replied, her voice steadying, "that you were dead to her. That the mother she had treated with such cruelty was gone, and that the woman you are now belongs to herself alone." Her face went pale. Elena. She did not expect to hear that. It was as if the ground shifted under her. The image of Clara shaken for once unsettled me. A part of me almost pitied her. Almost. But pity is a dangerous indulgence. I had given her pity before, and it had only chained me tighter. This time I chose distance. Still, Margot's words echoed in my mind long after I hung up the phone. Dead to her. The phrase lingered, both haunting and liberating. Perhaps it was true. The mother who had sacrificed everything had indeed died the moment Clara had wished me gone. What lived now was someone else entirely. Yet as much as I tried to close the door, the confrontation with Margot told me something chilling. Clara was no longer content with threats and letters. She was searching. She was moving, crossing boundaries, pressing closer. And if she had come that far, how much further would she go? That night I stood on my balcony, the city of Lisbon glowing below, and asked myself a question that refused to leave. How long until she finds me? Weeks passed, and slowly the storm inside me shifted. Clara's voice still echoed across the ocean, but its grip on me had loosened. I no longer jumped when the phone rang, no longer trembled when letters arrived with her familiar handwriting. Instead, I began to feel a strange kind of strength. For decades, my life had been built on silence, on burying my own needs under the weight of sacrifice. Now I found myself speaking, writing, confessing the truth I had hidden even from myself. One evening after a long walk along the river, I sat at my small desk and opened my journal. The pages were already filled with fragments, receipts, listed in detail, memories of sleepless nights, the sound of Clara's cruel words on her birthday. But that night I began something different. I started to write not only for myself but for others. I wrote about the slow erosion of love, about the way small sacrifices pile into mountains, about the moment when giving becomes self-destruction. The words poured out of me steady and relentless, like a dam breaking. I wrote for hours, describing each chapter of my life with unflinching honesty. I told the truth of every dollar spent, every night lost, every time I convinced myself that love was enough reason to give everything away. I wrote about the birthday when my daughter asked me to disappear, and how those words meant to wound had freed me instead. When I finished, I looked at the stack of pages. It was not a journal anymore. It was a letter not to Clara, but to the countless mothers I imagined, women trapped in the same quiet prisons I had lived in. A letter to anyone who had ever been told that their love was too much, their presence too heavy, their sacrifices invisible. I titled it, "When a Mother Decides to Live." At first I planned to keep it private, but Margot, who visited often and sipped tea at my table with her usual sparkle, insisted otherwise. "Elena," she said, flipping through the pages with sharp eyes, "this is not just your story. This is a mirror. Women everywhere need to see their reflection in these words. If you keep it locked away, you are doing them the same disservice you once did yourself, hiding, silencing, enduring." Her conviction startled me. I had always thought of myself as ordinary, too small to matter in the wider world. But Margot was right. This was larger than me. With her help, I sent the manuscript to an online magazine that published stories of reinvention and survival. I expected nothing, but a week later the editor replied with breathless excitement. "Your story is powerful, raw, and necessary," she wrote. "We want to share it. Would you consider speaking on our channel, perhaps an interview? People need to hear you in your own voice." I hesitated. To speak publicly meant exposing myself even in this new world where I had hidden. It meant Clara might see it, might twist it, might come after me with renewed fury. But then I thought of the countless voicemails, the accusations of senility, the years of being erased. And I realized that if I remained silent, Clara would win again. She would keep my truth buried beneath her lies. So I said yes. The interview was filmed in a quiet cafe near the river. The camera felt intrusive at first, its black eyes staring into me, but I spoke as I had written, plainly, honestly, without flourish. I told the story of a mother who had given everything and a daughter who had asked her to vanish. I spoke of the night I realized that disappearance could be liberation, and of the life I had built in the shadow of that choice. When the video went live, I expected only a handful of views. Instead, it spread like wildfire. Within days, thousands of comments appeared, many from women confessing their own stories. One wrote, "My son is 40 and still demands I pay his rent. I thought I was alone, now I see I am not." Another said, "My daughter only calls when she needs money. I cried listening to you because it felt like you were telling my story." The words poured in waves of recognition and grief. My story had cracked something open, and through the cracks, truth flooded in. But the most startling moment came when I received an email from David. His tone was unlike anything I had heard from him before. He admitted that Clara's cruelty had gone too far, that he had watched her manipulate and exploit me for years, but had lacked the courage to intervene. He confessed that the children missed me deeply, and that Clara had lied to them, saying I was too sick to visit. His message ended simply, "I know it is too late to fix what we destroyed, but I wanted you to know that I see the truth now, and I am sorry." I read the email 3 times, unsure whether to believe it. But even if his words came too late, they mattered. They were the first acknowledgement from anyone in that family that I had been used, discarded, and betrayed. It did not change my decision to stay away, but it brought a flicker of validation I had needed more than I realized. Still, I knew Clara would not accept defeat quietly. If the interview reached her, and I had no doubt it would, she would see it as betrayal, as exposure. She would rage, she would scheme, she would find new ways to twist the story. I braced myself, not with fear this time, but with readiness. For once I was not hiding. Weeks later, I received another letter. This one was not from Clara or David. It was from the twins, written in careful handwriting, each word etched with sincerity. They told me they missed me, that they knew their mother had said terrible things, that they were proud of me for being brave. At the bottom of the page, they had drawn a picture of me, standing by mountains, smiling free. Tears blurred the page. For the first time since my disappearance, I felt something shift. My legacy was no longer one of sacrifice alone. It was becoming something else: resilience, dignity, truth. But even as I clutched their letter to my chest, another thought gnawed at me. Clara had lost her grip, but people like her do not vanish into silence. They rise again in sharper, darker forms. The interview had given me a voice, but had it also painted a target on my back? Months passed, and the letter from my grandchildren became a quiet light I carried with me. Their words, so pure and honest, steadied me in moments when the shadows of Clara's voice threatened to creep back into my thoughts. Each time doubt whispered, I read their message again, tracing the uneven strokes of their handwriting, and I remembered why I had chosen this path. Lisbon had begun to feel like home. The narrow streets, the tiled walls, the scent of grilled sardines curling from open windows, they welcomed me into a rhythm that was not hurried, not demanding. I spent mornings walking by the river, afternoons in small cafes, writing, and evenings watching the sun sink into the Atlantic, painting the sky in oranges and violets. For the first time in decades, my life was not a race to meet the needs of others. It was simply life, mine alone. Yet the echoes of the past had not entirely vanished. Clara's voice still reached me, though, no longer through calls or letters. Friends from my old city wrote, occasionally telling me she had lost the house after months of unpaid bills. They told me she moved into a smaller apartment, that David had finally found steady work at a factory, and that Clara herself had been forced to take a job. For the first time in her life, she was standing on her own, though bitterly, angrily, without grace. One friend wrote that Clara often spoke of me, though never with remorse. She called me selfish, cruel, heartless. She told others that I had abandoned her when she needed me most. But then in quieter tones she admitted what she never would to my face, that without me she had no safety net, no shield, no rescuer. She had been forced to learn what it meant to live with the consequences of her own choices, and so across the ocean a strange justice unfolded. Meanwhile, my own life blossomed in ways I had never expected. My book expanded from the letter, and the interview was published by a small European press. It spread quickly, translated into languages I did not speak, carried into homes of women I would never meet. Letters arrived from Spain, from Italy, from Brazil, from women who told me they finally felt seen. Some had left toxic families, some had drawn boundaries for the first time in their lives. Others simply thanked me for reminding them that love does not mean endless sacrifice. Each message was like a thread binding me to a greater whole. I was no longer just a mother who had disappeared. I was part of a chorus of voices rising against silence, against manipulation, against the quiet erasure of mothers everywhere. And then one spring morning, a letter arrived in handwriting that was shakier than before. It was Clara's. I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it, the paper trembling between my fingers. Inside, her words were softer than I had ever known them. She admitted that she had been wrong. She confessed that losing the house had broken her, that struggling to make ends meet had shown her a glimpse of what I had carried for decades. She wrote of exhaustion, of sleepless nights, of children she could not always calm. And in those words, perhaps for the first time in her life, I saw something close to recognition. But the apology was incomplete. It was tangled with excuses wrapped in self-pity. She wrote that she had only wished me gone because she was overwhelmed, that she had not meant it, that she had spoken out of anger. She begged me to return not to the woman I had been, but to the role I had filled, the rescuer, the giver, the endless well. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. I did not respond. Some words once spoken cannot be erased. Some wounds once cut cannot be healed by half apologies. Instead, I returned to my balcony where the mountains in the distance were kissed by morning light. I breathed deeply, my heart calm. The old Elena, the woman who would have rushed back at the first sign of regret, was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned that survival sometimes requires disappearance, and that love without respect is not love at all. That evening, I hosted a small gathering of friends from my writing group. We shared stories, laughter, and glasses of wine as the sky darkened. At one point, someone asked me if I ever thought of returning, if I ever longed for reconciliation. I paused, then smiled faintly. I think of the past, yes, I said, but I do not long for it, because to go back would mean erasing the woman I have become, and I will never do that again. The room was silent for a moment, then filled with nods of quiet understanding. Later, as I stood alone on the balcony, I thought of my grandchildren. One day they might come to see me, to walk these streets, to sit beside me by the river, and when they did, I would tell them the truth. That their grandmother had chosen to live, not just survive. That her disappearance was not abandonment, but rebirth. That sometimes the only way to save yourself is to vanish from the place where you are most used and least valued. The music of the city rose around me, laughter, footsteps, the distant call of a street vendor. I lifted my glass to the night, to the stars above the water, to the life I had reclaimed. I had been told to disappear. I had granted that wish, but in disappearing, I had finally found myself. This story is about the courage it takes to break free from toxic relationships, even when those relationships are with the people we love most. It shows that sacrifice without respect is not love, and that self-worth cannot be measured by how much we give to others. Sometimes the only way to survive is to let go, to disappear from the lives of those who exploit us, and to be reborn in the life we were meant to live. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. I would also love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of this story resonated most with you.